that's also market failure. To start with an example, the example I like to use, because I think it's quite easy to understand, is that of public transport. In anything, in any situation where people live apart, private public transport would cause market failure. Why? If you have, let's imagine you have one line of a bus that goes for 3 kilometers. And it goes straight to the main street. A lot of people need to get on here, right? So it's very profitable. But now there's people who live on the hill in the back, 4 kilometers from there. It would be profitable for the bus to go pick up these people, as in they would pay more than it costs the bus in gas. But they won't do it, because in the time it takes to drive up the hill, they could have driven the first route twice and made a lot more money. So the bus is going to keep driving between point A and B, that's where it makes more money, and it will never pick up the people at point C. Because it's always more profitable to just make circles than to go pick up the people. That's why public transport is public, because the state forces the company to go into less profitable routes. And it forces the company to pick you up if you live in a village. Because otherwise, the public transport would always stay in the city, right? It is always better to just keep transporting more people inside the city than go to the village and pick people up there. Do you understand this concept? So that's a market failure. If the people act in their self-interest, then some people will never get the service. The same with provision of water to villages, or electricity, or internet. It is rarely in the interest of the company selling you these things to, to lay a whole cable to your house if you live in some rancho, right? They'll make less money of selling you the subscription and it costs them to make the cable. So the state needs to force them to do that. Mr. Hugo.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that that's also what happens with water in Chile, because as it is private, the companies do not want to give water to the peoples in the rural areas because it's not profitable to install like all the plums, because, well, they want to make as much money as if they direct that water to the cities.
Yes, that's a good example. So the important thing here is to understand that it's not because something is profitable that the market will do it. The market will do what is most profitable. So I could sell some to you, but if I can sell to someone else that pays me more, I'm going to do that. So you will never get it, right? This is that's just an example. I'm going to give you a whole bunch more of market failure. Mr. Diego.
Yeah, I just didn't understood why you told you don't like this point of view.
Because it assumes, well, that's an for ideological reasons, because it assumes that even if things go normal, that's okay. But if things go normal under capitalism, you still generate inequality and you still make money of exploitation. So you basically, ideologically, what this is a way for the center left to boycott the far left. They say, we can say what you say without criticizing the system, right? We can get the state to do things while avoiding Marxism as a whole, basically, as a theory, which is okay. I think it's true. I think market failure exists. I just think we'll soon see some other reasons, right? This is just one reason why there's public policy. There's other reasons that I think are important too. That's more what I meant. It's a very technical, very mathematical approach to things. So some other examples of market failure are the classic ones. They're monopoly formation, right? If you only have one company selling, they will not sell at the lowest price. They'll sell at the highest price they can make. And that's not in the interest of consumers. So that monopoly should either be broken by the state or the state should take the monopoly And since the state is not trying to make profit, they could sell you at the lowest price possible. Or cartel formation, which is a variant of monopoly, but with more people, where you have multiple companies that will that kind of agree to charge you very high prices. And they could compete and make money by beating the competition, but it's actually better for them not to compete and just to agree. This is illegal in most countries. They could make more money if they would agree not to compete and just all charge high prices. You see this with some cell phones or with some certain services where you have 2 or 3 players where it doesn't work. You also have certain services where competition is suboptimal for the market. So where you produce more wealth if you would not compete. An example of that are railroads. It is better for everyone if there's just one railroad company. Because if you compete, how are you going to compete? Because there's only one road, right? So then you need to alter, like you can drive a train, I can drive a train. You can drive a train, I can drive a train. That exists, but it's not better than if in a monopoly situation. Because it's just clumsy, right? You cannot compete literally the same lane. So in those situations, again, it's better for the state to have the monopoly than for parties to compete on something where you cannot really compete on. You also have certain situations that there's many forms of market failure. I'm just going to name a few to get the idea started. If you have a situation in which it takes a lot of money to make something once, but after you made it once, it's very cheap, right? So it's going to happen in medicine, are an easy example of this. Company is going to set a high price to make back their original money, or to make back the risk. But they will keep this high price even 20 years later, right? While most medicine is very cheap to make. Painkillers, for example, are very cheap to produce. So the client keeps paying for something that is not relevant anymore. In these situations, if the government would do it, they could lower the price because they could mediate the risk, right? They could tell, for example, as US did with Pfizer, they said, look, we're going to buy for $2 billion. If it's good or bad, we're going to buy for $2 billion. So the risk of production is taken away, so they can now produce at a lower cost. Well, if you would not have that guaranteed sale, the product would be a lot more expensive, if that makes sense. In this case, you really want the product because they're vaccines, right? We all want there to be vaccines. So that's a market failure where the state needs to step in for an optimal distribution of goods. You also have external costs. This means that your transaction causes harm to a third person. So there's no problem between the seller and the client. There's a problem with someone else. All forms of air pollution are an example of this, right? You do certain economic activity, the client is happy, but that causes environmental damage to other people. In that scenario, the market fails to deliver optimal results for everyone. Or you have, I don't know, you sell legally, but the street in which you sell it, like you and all the other stores sell weed, so that's going to attract a whole lot of high people, which is going to cause problems in the neighborhood, right? Because you have all kind of like high people and junkies and stuff. They would be good for the government to regulate those things. The opposite is true too. You have external benefits. That means that you do something that someone else profits off, but you cannot stop them. A very simple example of this is beekeeping. If your trade is to have bees, if you're a beekeeper, your bees are going to fly out and they're going to fertilize stuff. So if you're a farmer, this is good that your neighbor is a beekeeper, right? But you can't charge him because you can't stop the bees, and you shouldn't. So there's situations in which that's a very abstract example. There's situations in which you cause benefits to other people that you can't claim, and so everybody's going to try to abuse you, basically. So in that case, it's better if the state does it, because the state doesn't mind being abused, right? The more happy people, the better for the state. We have situation of imperfect knowledge. Markets assume very naively that people perfectly understand what they're doing, which is not true, right? You saw that last year, Secretario de Salud stepped in to force companies to put labels on their food that something has too much salt, etc. Right? There was a market failure of them trying to hide from people what's really in the product, and people not knowing what they're doing, and therefore consuming too much of something, and that's not good for them at the end. I'll give you some other examples later of insurance and how this works. There's some products that are just very hard to compare, like insurances or certain services or loans, for example, where individuals might not really understand what's happening. And it's good for the government to then, for example, have a system of certification that it separates reliable ones from unreliable ones. Another example, I know I keep going, Ms. Sophia, I know this is tiring, but I want to make the point. Or collective benefits without individual gains. This is very common. These are situations in which it would be good for all of us to do something, and it would be good for the economy to do if we would all do it. But it's not in our individual interest to do it or to be the first one. This, for example, in a non-market thing, showing off, right? Let's say you want to impress a girl. So you're going to pay for stuff, but there's someone else in the group that's also going to pay for stuff. So now you're going to buy more expensive stuff, and he's going to buy more expensive wine, and you're going to buy more expensive wine. It would be better for both of you to not do this, right? You're both losing a whole lot of money and showing off, but you don't want to be the one that does it first, right? You want the other guy to stop doing it first. In real life, there's a lot of scenarios where this is true. One of the biggest ones is education. It is not in the interest of any company to offer primary education to poor people, because poor people can't afford it, but you just won't make your money back. That's why you only have private education from middle class and up. You don't have private education in the poorest. However, and for poor people, it's not even rational to go to private education, because they can make more money working their kids in the field than to go to primary school. However, for the economy as a whole, it is better if those people go to school, because they will be more productive if they go to school, right? So for the GDP, it is better that poor people go to school, but it's not good for any company to offer that service. So in that case, it is the state who's going to offer the service for the benefit of the whole economy and all other companies. Do you understand that? Now again, this fails. This fails again if those people leave. That's our drama at uni, right? Our best students then try to go to Canada, and like we spend all this money on training them, and then they're gone. And you have again government failure in correcting the market failure, because it was going to be good for the economy until they left. But anyway, that's an example. So markets where the government very typically intervenes in are the health sector. Health sector doesn't really work because markets are based on the assumption that persons cannot buy something, that you can say no. But if your arm is broken and you're next to a hospital, you're going to go to that hospital, right? And then they charge you forever. Or when our child was born, once it's born, you cannot be like, no, I don't want this, right? You're like, do you want this to let it die? You're like, no, okay, that's 50,000 pesos a day. That's a literal example. You don't really have a choice, right? In that moment. So in healthcare, state education, as I just explained, things like water, things that people need anyway, and we're not buying them or not providing them, it's just not an option. In transport, These are sectors where market failure is very common. So that's one reason why policy exists. A very technical reason. But there's more than market failure. There's also individual failure, and institutions that fail. You see, market failure and market failure theory is still based on this idea of the rational consumer. The idea that people always do things in their self-interest and they do them perfectly, right? They're rational actors. This person is called economic man. Economic man is selfish and disciplined and rational. Now, economic man does not exist. He's not a real man. If he would exist, he would be some kind of sociopath that you wouldn't want to be friends with. But most people, all people, are not like this. People do things wrong. People fail. And they fail sometimes in very predictable ways. So in those situations, you could say that it's not the market who does it wrong, it's the people. That you would have an argument for some government intervention, right? That you have an argument for some paternalistic intervention, for the government to make a public policy target at those people, on the condition that that long term is better than not doing something. Because people do things wrong, right? But not, you shouldn't stop them at all points from doing things wrong, because maybe they will learn something from doing things wrong, or maybe you helping them will, cost so much more than just letting it be. Not in money necessarily, but for those people, for example, that it's better not to do anything at all. But there are situations in which this individual failure would merit government intervention. What those situations are is a political question, right? Liberals will have a much stricter understanding of in which situations the government could make a policy about what people do than conservatives or socialists do. Conservatives and socialists would have a broader understanding of when individual failure merits government policy. So that's a bit of a political discussion, but some examples so you have something to think about. Drug abuse, right? Or any substance abuse. If it's of medicine, this becomes a market failure, because for the market, it's better to sell you the thing you're addicted to, right? But it's not better for society that that happens. You see this with painkillers, for example, in the United States. They know it's addictive. The companies that make them, they know it's addictive. They also know that statistically it's a gateway drug, because you will become numb to painkillers at some point, and the only thing stronger than painkillers are things like morphine or opium. So they will lead you to there. Often because painkillers, some actually have opium in them, so you're already used to them. So that doesn't work in a market situation, right? And also with actual illegal drugs. Some people will deal with it well, other people will not. On the whole, the people not dealing with it well cause more damage than the good people, right? So certain drugs, not all, but certain drugs would merit government intervention, right? For example, heroin. Nothing good comes of heroin. People who say it does don't really know heroin addicts. I lived in a very, very drug-infested neighborhood in Belgium, and there's nothing funny about heroin. So that would merit government intervention. Child abuse is another one, right? This is not capitalism's fault, though I'll probably write an essay one day saying it is. But this is not the market's fault, right? If parents lock their kid up in a cage, but it is their fault. Yet this is not just them doing something to themselves, it's them doing something to someone else. So the government would have a reason to make a policy about this, right? To invent the diff, to guide parents. Traffic. Roads are private. This is not a market problem. It's just people constantly mess up in traffic. People cannot be trusted to stick to the rules. It's always too tempting. So government needs to police that. We need things like speed bumps, etc., etc. And if the government looks at this at the very big picture, it's a lot more economical to stop people from getting an accident than to dealing with the accident and the health costs of that, right? So investing in speed bumps might be more efficient than investing in more hospital beds, right? Or you have, for example, there's situations that are unnecessarily violent. You have certain neighborhoods or prisons, or another example of this, where everybody acts aggressive. And they act aggressive because if they didn't, they would become a victim, right? You have to show yourself aggressive. And if somebody does something to you, you have to beat them up. Because if you don't beat them up, everybody's going to do this to you. Yeah. This is how prisons work, but certain neighborhoods work like that too. Now, this is a community failure because it's everybody wants to stop doing this, except some few idiots of 80 IQ. But most people who are in this, most people in prison wish they didn't have to act tough because it's very tiring to act tough all the time, right? You never get a moment to think or just to relax. You're always paranoid. What they all want is to stop this nonsense. But nobody dares to set the first step because then they're going to become a victim, right? In these kind of situations, again, it's good for government or for police to force them to do this. Not that the government has actually found a way to solve this, but that would be at least a demand. There's a demand for public policy there. Do you understand my examples?
Yes, teacher.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. So that's it. Maybe this is too simple for you, and I apologize. The next thing will also be very simple, which is collective purpose. That would be the third reason. So the whole market failure theory and the individual failure theory still assume that the government should only do things to resolve problems of society, right? To resolve some kind of disequilibrium, right, in economic terms. But that's a very undemocratic understanding of public policy. In a democracy, in a strong political sphere, democracies are not just there to solve problems that the market cannot. Democracies are also there so that informed publics can demand that certain things happen, that they can signal that they want something, that they want to achieve something that they cannot do alone, that they want to achieve something that they want the state to do. They want the state to chase a certain purpose, a certain collective ambition that they have, right? So it's not just, oh, I have this problem in my life and I wish somebody would solve it, but I can't solve it alone, or the market won't solve it, so I need the government to do it. It's more that we want something to happen. Whether it's based on our identity, like we want more medals in the Olympics, right? That's not a market problem, and that's definitely not a need. It's just an ambition that you want, and it's not going to happen without you collectively, trying to do something for that. Or you want your country to play a bigger role in international relations, or you want your country to look good, right? Or you together want to set some kind of goal for your country, like to make it a leader in some field. Or you want to reduce poverty, not because poverty is your problem, just because you think that would be cool if your country would be less poor. So publics can themselves signal what they think the public sector should do, what the state should do, regardless of any problem, right? It doesn't need to be related to that. For example, going to space. The Americans didn't need to go to space. There's no reason at all to do this, right? Nobody needed this. This is not an economic need. Yet they spend a whole lot of money on this because people think it's cool when that happens, right? Nowadays, UK space travel became privatized and the biggest companies do it. But for the first 100 years of space travel, this was not true, right? Or go to the bottom of the ocean. We all want to know what's there. Nobody wants to pay for that, right? So that's the thing you would want the state to do. But also policies very nationalist, but like keeping immigrants out. There's no market need for this. Matter of fact, the market wants immigrants, but a lot of people don't want them. And a lot of people would definitely want the government to spend more money on checking the borders for this, right? This is just a purpose of a nationalist people, that they want this to happen. Or supporting a religion. There's no market need to support this, but certain countries really want their religion to be boosted and to represent it, and they take this really serious. The same with preserving certain traditions or heritage, right? This is not an economical problem. It's just something people want. And thus they want the public sector to create public policies for that, to protect indigenous people's traditions, for example, to protect their rights or something, or protect language. These are not things that economically would normally happen. But people, although individually this might not have particularly much value to them or not enough to pay for it, they all would think it's a good idea if we would do this. And thus that creates collective purpose. You understand this, right? Because you're super smart. All right, let me take a pause here. Do you have any questions?
No, teacher.
Okay, are you falling asleep, Miss Mariana?
No, teacher, I'm here.
Okay, good. Then let's get to the second question. That is, how do actual policies happen? Where do they come from, right? What are the moments in which they happen? Policies, in the sense of policy plans, right, usually comes from experts, as in the idea, right, comes from all kind of policy analysts. But that's not the question we ask. We don't ask the question who wrote the policy. We ask the question, how did those plans, once somebody wrote them, right, ended up becoming public policies? Where does a policy plan become a policy? Right? We have a whole literature that we're going to discuss later about how policy plans get produced and how you should do that, right? But for the sake of argument, just assume that I wrote all of them, right? Tu wrote every policy ever, right? That's not the question. The question is, when do they enter the political agenda? Now I'm going to narrate to you a framework that I did not invent, that says that there's of Page, who says there's 4 points of entry. There's 4 origins of policy. There's 4 moments that policies happen. Now, to fully understand this, we have to acknowledge that the word policy fundamentally can refer to 2 things, and we're going to talk about both of them mixed. But conceptually, policies are both proposals, as in the policies of a political party, right? What are your policies? Even if they're not in power. For example, PRD isn't and probably will never be, again, in power, but they have a program with policies, right? So talking about PRD's policies makes sense. And then you have actions. These are the things that actually happen, the things that the government actually does. They're kind of different. You could have actions without a proposal. We'll get to that later. Like just the state start doing stuff. And you can have proposals that never become an action, right? So an action would be the gas spinners there. It's just actually happening. But policy is both, because they could become each other, right? Now, how this exactly works, of course, is context dependent. The model I'm going to explain you is based on the West. It's based on US and Europe, although those already are very different from each other. It depends a lot on, we saw this last time, right? When we talked about institutional constraints. It depends a lot on how concentrated the power is. In a very fragmented system like the United States, where the executive power cannot really do anything at all without the legislative power, right? To insane levels, in the sense that if they want to appoint if they want to hire staff, if the president wants to hire staff, he needs that approved by the House of Representatives. So it's very fragmented, right? In that, it's a lot more confusing how things work. We don't live in that system. We live in a more presidential system, which is a little bit more top-down, right? Policies typically come more from the palace than they come from parliament. And that's a good thing in the sense that there's a higher chance for it to actually happen. The president can make a stronger commitment to it. If he says it's going to happen, there's a much higher chance it's going to happen than when Biden says they're going to do something. Because with Biden, there's a lot more veto players, as we saw last time, that can stop him from doing that. So we're talking in kind of our context, right? So again, there's 4 points of entry, 4 points where policies could get born, ignoring who exactly makes them. But we assume that the plan is already there. First one is principles. Principles, very broad term. This could be values, this could be ideology, or well, just principles of typically the leader that inform policy. So governments, right, besides having specific policies, their policy sometimes is also just a general principle, a general way of doing things, something that's typical for that government. And they do things always that way. And in everything they're going to do, in every specific policy, is going to take that form. So often leaders, they don't meddle with what exactly administration should do. They just say, I want it done this way. And whatever you do, it must be done this way. Those are general policy principles. So privatization, for example, is one, right? Whatever you do, I want the market to try to do it, right? Try to make it so that the market doesn't. That would be a very neoliberal principle. And then everybody in the state has to go and see how their policy could be adjusted to that. Or transparency could be another general principle that could change the way things work. Or to take one example from AMLO, right? From bien de todos, primero los pobres. It's one of the general principles of the fourth transformation, which asks of whatever you are, if you're in public service, to think about this. Yeah. Or the anti-corruption thing. And these are all things that just, they're part of the general style of government, and that will lead to policy. That will lead to policy or changes in policy. So often come in the sense of buzzwords, right? Like social innovation, or privatization, or new public management, or deregulation, or something like that, that come from the top. The top says, we want this. And then it's up to the lower people to, well, to scramble, right? It's for government agencies to either come up with new policies, or to find them, right? To find the policy makers, the policy writers, the policy analysts, and say, hey, you have any ideas that fit with this? Apparently we need to do this. And they're like, oh, we have this. Or, which happens more often, to just reframe what they already were planning to do, right? They have some proposals on the desk that didn't really fit in with what the last government wanted. And now they have a new concept. And they're like, oh yeah, yeah, this thing we have here, that sounds kind of innovative. And they'll just reframe it like that. They'll do the same thing, but better, right? For example, the Becas Benito Juarez, the support that the government gives to children, is not new. Peña Nieto also did this. He just did it less. And it was less broad, it was less money, and it was to less people, and it was more indirect. So they took that policy and they made it into the same thing, but more in line with the fourth transformation. More people in it, broader, more money. So that's a reframing or repackaging of something to match a principle, right? Now these principles, did you understand me so far?
Yes, we do. It's very clear.
I do.
Okay. These principles, they don't always come from the leader. Often these ideas or these ideologies or these kind of guidelines or buzzwords or labels, they come from somewhere else. They come from other countries. Like there's certain things that are hip in public policy. And Nivleon might copy it from another state, or they might copy it from Texas. Because, oh, in Texas, they're talking a lot about, I don't know what, backpack funding, which is funding where you fund the client, not the service. So we need to do that too. And in those cases, that can lead to very different policies, because you're taking a certain concept that you saw with your neighbors, and you're trying to do that too. But since your context is different, you're going to end up doing different things. And that leads to a whole new set of policies. So this could be things like zero tolerance, right? And you apply that, but that means some different in United States as in Mexico, right? United States, that's a lot of police beating people down. Mexico, zero tolerance would mean all out war. So that's, you know, a little different type of policies that, like you talk, Calderon talks the same language as George Bush did, but it meant something very different for the people here, right? Because the crime that you're talking about is on a different level. One example of this, have you ever heard of the idea of a creative class?
Like social class or
No,
a school class?
no, like more like social class. Creative class is a concept, is a buzzword that comes from urban development. I think one of the first guys started using it is Richard Florida. Richard Florida is an economist, and he wrote some books about this. And these books became bestsellers, and especially amongst policy people. Most policy people in urban planning have read these books. I've read this book too. The idea of the creative class, very neoliberal, is that to boost your city's economy, you need the right people. And the people you need are not poor people or traditional people, they are creative people. You need the people that work in Starbucks on their laptop. Those are the ones you need, right? You need people with tattoos who then going to develop Uber, and then you have that new app in your city, etc. Those are the people you need. And to attract them, you need to do things that they find interesting. So you should be very diverse, and you should have a lot of culture, and you should have a lot of public amenities, and a lot of coffee shops and cheese stores, and things that attract hipsters. Basically, you want hipsters. That's creative class theory, and that will make your city rich. That idea got popularized in the United States. All kind of cities want to do it and pay this dude, Richard Florida, to give them advice. But other countries started looking at this too, and they started using just the general idea of creative, right? So the idea of creative industries, for example, industries which are based on creativity, like game design, for example, and that you want to attract those. So originally, this was a neoliberal plan to basically, well, it's not neoliberal. It's a very competitive plan, which basically fused the pursuit of money with kind of identity politics, right? Because you want the edgy people to be there. But they also, in other contexts, they use this to, for example, you see this sometimes where you would refurbish old buildings into workspaces. So let's say you have an abandoned factory And then you're going to have all kind of designer studios in that because it's a cool environment and hipsters will like it. And like, you know, they can take cool pictures in it, like stand in front of the glass or the factory window, etc. And that's going to attract those type of people. And that's going to, create growth. So from this line of thought, you would have these public workspaces, which then becomes a little bit more progressive, right? Because they don't pay rent, etc. Or you could strip out the whole creativity part and just remember that we need hipsters. and that would mean that you just give them money that exists. There are certain cities in the United States that if you're highly educated and you're creative, they'll give you $10,000. Like just come here. Like if you register in our city, if you put your name down in our citizen registry, you get $10,000 out of pocket. So they don't bother with any of the creative stuff. They're just straight up bribing people to come there. These are all variants of the same label, the same creative class label, right? They all became different public policies depending on how left or right or resourceful your policymakers are. Do you understand this? How general principles become many things? Hello?
Yeah, I understand.
So it was a long rant. I think one of the first books I've ever written in was on this. So there's a lot about it. These are buzzwords. Now buzzwords and principles next can become policy lines. Policy lines very broadly means those parts of the public agenda that are deliberately pushed by the government. So the government has certain principles, right? Certain things, AMLO says, for example, no mentir, no robar, no traicionar, but they don't really mean much, like when it comes to public policy. But you also have things that they more explicitly push, like helping the South, for example, or helping farmers, or anti-corruption, or things like that, that they really want to happen, right? Some parts of public policy are not intentional. They're just things you have to do. For example, managing the debt, or dealing with floods, or organizing elections. These are things that are just going to happen anyway, and you need to deal with them. But then there's parts of the public agenda where basically the party that won is going to push their agenda through, going to push their policy lines through. This is the most clear space. So here it becomes a bit about agenda setting, right? If you have a policy plan, how do you get it to be in this policy line? How do you get it to be something that the government talks a lot about and gives orders to make happen? So a government, right, especially a coalition government, has a lot of potential policy lines, right? They have thick programs, and if they're made of multiple parties, they have multiple programs, and they all want to realize them. But not all of them actually become a thing. Not all of them become something that will have mainstream attention from both the government, the media, parliament, etc. Right? What becomes a mainstream policy line depends on a lot of things, on the positive effects of them, obviously, right? But also on the symbolism. I explained this last time with prisoners, that there's a lot of things the government could do, but they would look bad. So they're not going to do them, or they're only going to do them on Christmas Eve when nobody's watching, right? So that policy line has to wait till that moment. Or there are things that are not that important, but the symbolism of them is very strong. Because I don't know, it happened to some child or a dog, right? Some dog, and then it got filmed, and people saved the dog. And then suddenly the government has to start investing in dog shelters or something that they didn't plan at all, but just, it looks good. Or how emotionally charged it is, right? Or how urgent it is. They all shape it. But in principle, these policy ideas come from the leader, right? They have certain plans. That's why they want to get elected. They want to get things done. Or they could enter the agenda from the outside. So the leader has a certain amount of plans in his head. He sits down at his desk, right? And he says, let's do this. But then there's also things that other people put on their desk. So he walks up, He wakes up. He has ideas while he's brushing his teeth. He's going to the Oval Office. Let's say he's the American president. And by the time he's there, there's already 5 things on his desk. He's like, what the hell is this? Right? Today I want to talk about this. But no, other people made sure that there's certain ideas in their head. Policy entrepreneurs, right? People who got an invitation to the White House. And they're like, hey, Mr. President, now you're here anyway. How about we deregulate, I don't know, fighting? So you can have, like you don't have doping checks anymore, or weight classes in fighting or something. Or how we talk about this. That's the whole field of agenda setting and lobbying. I'm not going to talk about that much today. I'm just explaining you that that's how policies also happen. Mr. Diego.
Yeah, I have a doubt about the concept of policy entrepreneur. It's different from policymaker. It's like the private form or something.
Yes. The policy entrepreneur can be a policy maker. Like it could be somebody who works for the government. It's just somebody who tries to get a policy and a public agenda that's not there already. So if you work, for example, if you're a general in the army and you want to start a certain war, the president is not really interested in starting that war, right? You can start a campaign, and every time you see him, you start talking about how this country looks really dangerous, and I don't know about them. That's the kind of policy entrepreneurship where you try to push something. Let me give you an example, because this is hard to talk about because you don't see policy entrepreneurs, right? You kind of imagine them, but this is not documented, of course. Let me give you an example of a guy I know in Belgium. There was a man called Theo Vaas, who's a rich man, an entrepreneur in, what did he do again? Real estate, I think. And he took, I don't know why, but he took a big interest in poverty and poverty reduction, my field. And he had an idea, in my opinion, a particularly bad idea. But his idea was, we're going to solve poverty by pairing poor people with non-poor people. And then those non-poor people are going to coach the poor people, right? Because poor people are ignorant. And so we're going to have successful people, and each successful person is like 5 buddies, which are poor people. And then he sees them once a month and they learn from their success. This is the idea. I am, for various reasons, I'm not going to explain now. I don't like this. I don't think it works. I've never seen it work. I think it's a weird idea. But anyway, he had that idea and he wanted it. And he got it. So what did he do? First of all, he started changing his plan so it would fit within the policy principles that we just discussed. Back then, something that was very hot in that city was social innovation. And he said, well, my project is very socially innovative, and it was. So he every time social innovation was brought up by the government, he was there. It's like, hey, pick me. I got a great idea. He started doing network events. He started inviting everybody that has some say on poverty or that has any influence on public opinion on it, including me, for example. So he would invite within a city, right? Not that I'm very important in Belgium, but so everybody that works on poverty and social innovation, he would invite in his, his office was the entire floor of an apartment building. Like it was gigantic. So it's very impressive, right? Because he's a real estate mogul. So he'd invite people who normally, social workers, people who work with poor people. So they're very impressed. Oh, I never come in these type of places. And he would invite them to talk about something else, but then he would pitch his idea every time at the end, right? And then you'd invite people from the city. So everybody who's somewhat in this field is there. And none of them really like his idea, but they like being there, so they want to go to the next event. So they're like, oh yeah, I'll give you my advice, etc., etc. He would invite me over for dinner as my feedback, for example, on things, or for lunch, not dinner, and things like that. And I never really liked his plan, but anyway, he would use my feedback to expand, blah blah blah. And at the end of the day, he got like 60% of the funding. Like of the total budget that the city had for poverty, he got like more than half of it. because he was so good at networking and selling his essentially silly idea. But, you know, he got so many people to half agree to it that at the end of the day, it became public policy, and now he's doing it. He offered me a job. I didn't take it. But that's a policy entrepreneur, a very good example of one that strategically tries to push his idea. I'm an unsuccessful example of a policy entrepreneur. I'm also trying to push my ideas, but I'm not as slick as he is in doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it also reminds me to you like talking with politics in Nuevo León.
Yeah, I'm trying it too, but I'm not that good. But in my case, I'm also a policymaker. Like I actually did the research. It came to the plan. In his case, he's a real estate guy that just, I don't know why, but and it's good. He took a big interest in the topic, and that's his thing now. Also, policy lines can be started not from the head of the leader or of any policy group, but just because certain things happen. They might have always been the plan of the government, but the government was waiting for some moment to do it, and that happened then. For example, the whole energy reform and everything that came with it, and the buying of the refinery and the Gasbia Star, and all of that started because in Texas, the pipelines froze last winter. Do you remember that, when we went without heating for 4 days?
Yes.
They failed, and so AMLO said, enough, I don't want this to ever happen again, so I'm going to take control of this. He probably always wanted to do this. But this gave him a moment to do it, because people are like, fuck, we want heat. It's like, yeah, I'm going to prevent this from happening. Yeah, we need sovereignty in energy. So from that came policies, and from those policies, because we were going to sovereign. That was the plan, but he didn't really think it through. What's the next step? Okay, we need more gas. We need more. Okay, we're going to buy a refinery. Okay, this. Okay, so now we have more oil. We still don't have cheap enough gas. So we're going to now nationalize the gas sector, and this and that, and we need an energy reform law. And a lot of these things came from that one moment. So those moments is when new policy lines spring into life. Right? Before that, they didn't really dare to talk about it, but now they have a moment. Or policy also happens when the public notices a problem. A lot of problems and market failures exist, but nobody notices, or nobody cares that they happen. But suddenly, some will happen and people will care, right? You saw this with the case of Ingrid, for example, and the lay Ingrid, that people get murdered all the time, but this event, for whatever reason or timing, caught a lot of media attention, right? And something had to be done about it, and a new policy line was started, and the government started doing all kind of initiatives to do that. One of my old professors in the Netherlands once wrote a book about the discovery of poverty in the Netherlands. Netherlands is a fairly wealthy country, right? So most people think there's no poverty, including people in the Netherlands. But there always was poverty. You just, you don't see it if you live in a good neighborhood. Until one day, a bishop made a statement in a mass where he said, it's okay to steal bread. People are like, huh? He said, it's okay to steal bread because there's a lot of people that are hungry. And if you're hungry, God shouldn't stop you from stealing bread. And I know that went viral back in the 90s, whatever viral meant, right? It's in the newspapers and such. And people are like, well, what's he even talking about? Like, why would people, like, who's going hungry? And then the church suddenly was like, yeah, we feed 100,000 people of charity. You don't know this? People are like, no, we didn't know this. And, people suddenly discovered that there were hundreds of thousands of hungry people in the Netherlands. They've always been there. They just never, it just never came up in the media. And then the government suddenly panicked. They were like, what? There's poverty? Oh, and then somebody in the back was like, yeah, we tell you this every year in statistics. And the prime minister was, I didn't know this. Why nobody tells me this? So they suddenly had the anti-poverty programs and blah, blah, blah. This all started because of this bishop saying that. so it both has to do with what happens and what gets in the media's eye. That initiates new policy lines, and that's where new policy comes from. Again, these policy lines, they're not policies, right? They're when the executive says, we have to do something about this, we need to do this and this and that. He doesn't say what exactly you need to do. If he says, for example, if AMLO would say to the Secretary of Defense, you need to send the Guardia Nacional to Nuevo León because there's many kidnappings. He doesn't, okay, that's the order. That doesn't say exactly what they have to do, right? Are they going to build a new base? Are they going to patrol the highway? Are they going to engage us in war? Like they come guns blazing to these villages and everybody looks suspicious. They try to kill them. What exactly that means to send in the army is not said. So a policy line can still lead to many different policies, depending on what the people come up with, right? Then we get to the next level, which are measures. These are the things people come up with. So this means that policies in themselves lead to policies. It's a bit weird thing to understand, right? It gets vaguer the more you go down the ladder. But certain measures, certain things the government does in themselves lead to public policy. For example, a lot of policies have consequences. Those consequences, positive or negative, need to be dealt with, and you deal with them by creating more policies. In the United States, in the 90s, they cut welfare dramatically back. That caused a lot of crime. They also then try to solve that by increasing incarceration rates and making it a lot easier to go to prison. That caused that in the Black community, suddenly half the deaths were gone because they were in prison, right? For smoking weed or for some anything. You could go to prison for walking next to the sidewalk, whatever. You'd be arrested for anything. That caused family problems, right? And a lot of rise in youth crime. Then you need to deal with that youth crime, right? So your first policy leads to other things that you then need to deal with. This is a negative spike. It could also be positive, right? Let's say a very successful educational policy. Okay, now more people get to university, but now we need more universities, right? More people graduate from university. We solved that problem. Now people more graduate from university. Now you have all these people with diplomas, but none of space on the labor market. So now you need to solve that problem. So the things the government does, even if it never planned on doing it, lead to new things that the government needs to do. This is, I think, simple enough to understand. Another variant is that, again, what I just explained, right? So governments give people, especially if they're on different levels, like federal government gives a municipal government certain orders to do something, and money to do it, but they don't exactly explain how to do it. For example, to do vaccination is different in every municipality. The federal government gives you the vaccines and the army stands around and they bring volunteers along. But how exactly you administer that, like if you do it via CITAS or if you just come first served, or old people first, well, always old people first, that's federal, but whoever needs it for gets first, or how they do it, that's a municipal thing. So the specific policies there, right? The measure then causes new policies to happen. For example, they have to cut off the street so you can have a very long queue. If that's your plan, to just have people come, you need to do that. That changes traffic policy. Or if you don't do that, then you have CITAS, right? Then you need to have you need to hire 3 people to just pick up the phone to make appointments all day. And that's then a new policy thing, right? On a lower level, it causes more things to happen. Do you understand this? It's not that important as the other two, but that's still where policies can happen.
Yes, teacher.
Or like, for example, this is before your time, and before my time because I wasn't here. But I'm going to tell you about it. The old PRI had this solidarity, big solidarity program, right? It's called Solidarity, I think, which was really about nothing. It just meant that local governments had to do stuff for poor people, and they would give them money for it. But what exactly they did, they didn't really tell it. It's like Teleton, like we're gonna do things for poor people, yay! But then with the state, like, oh, like Zacatecas is gonna do this, good. So what they exactly did, that came down to local politicians, like, oh, we're gonna build basketball square. Are we gonna, build housing? Are we gonna do the water? Like that was very low and very corrupt. What they would actually do with it. The federal government didn't have much control. They just said, "Here's money for poor people. Do stuff." And they did things themselves, but on a city administration level, it came down to that. So that led to a whole bunch of different policies. Because in Veracruz, they would do some totally different than in Oaxaca, etc. Moving on to conclude, we come to activities. This means that the way the state does things can lead to new policies. So it's not the policy they're doing, it's just how civil servants actually do things can lead to new policies. The existence of undeliberated policies. You have policies that are plans, right, that are pushed from above. And then you have things that people actually do, which could also be policies. For example, the university has some kind of plan about mental health of students, right? And then you have what we actually do. Our policy is to not do it. So you have assigned, all of you have a tutor, right? And if you mail these people, they'll mail you back in 2 years. So our policy is to not do the policy, right? That's not deliberated. That's not planned. That's not, you couldn't propose this in a meeting, but that's kind of what happens. Or we do something else, right? For example, the policy is that we do competence-based teaching, competence-based learning, but I don't do that. If I could, I would convince everybody to not do it either, right? So I'm pushing an undeliberated policy of lecture teaching. So civil servants in practice deal with directives in different ways, and that can have two effects. Either that creates new policies that the higher government doesn't know about, but they just do it there. For example, the police starts charging protection money to shops, right? And that creates, the police basically comes like a gang. That was never the plan when we created the police, but that's just what it is in this city. And everybody knows that's how it works, right? And you get a whole new policy landscape surrounding that. Or it triggers policies that react to it. This is very vague, so let me say to the examples. The policy of policing in the United States is that the police serves the people, serves and protects, right? And that they serve all people and that they're your friend. That's what the lawmakers want to happen. Now, the police, on average, is a little bit racist. This is a hard fact, right? And their internal policy is that with minorities, you should threaten first and then ask, right? You ask them to get to the ground first before you check if there's a reason for them to get to the ground. And there's also a policy, and this is very hard policy. This is not like inventive, that if you do something wrong, you don't testify on that. So if your colleagues beat someone up, you won't say that he beat someone up. Whatever happens, you always protect the other policeman, right? So you won't testify against each other. You'll be slow with the paperwork. You will, if you need to arrest your friend, you're going to tell him that he's about to be arrested, he can run, right? Policemen do this. This is very well understood inside the police. That this is a rule. You protect each other in all situations. This is not something the government wants to happen. It's just something that happens, right? But it's as real as any other policy. So then to solve that, the government needs to make additional policies, right? They need to do courses and training and internal police and all kind of things the government needs to do to stop what the government is doing, because they're not the same actor. Does that make sense? Right? Racial bias with police causes discontent. Discontent, people ask the president to do something. Now the president needs to do something about his own government. Do you understand this example?
Yes, teacher.
Kind
Yeah, it's like the opposite, right?
of. Yeah. Or corruption, for example. The plan, the policy line is, well, that's actually debatable if the policy line was to be corrupt or not in the past, but it normally is not, right? Normally the plan is not to be corrupt. It's just something that happens and that people do in the government. And that in itself, so not the plan, but the carrying out of the plan can lead to radical policy changes. For example, the government could say, look, man, if we know that like 40% of this money is fake or doesn't end up, we're just going to stop altogether this policy. We're just not going to do it. As you saw a lot with this government. Or it will lead to new policy changes or new inspection, or for the police, for example. The plan was never, or at least the plan internally was never to create the Guardia Nacional. AMLO didn't talk about this a lot. This was not the plan to create a whole new police force. But very soon he realized that federal police is massively corrupt and you can't work with local. He also understood that he couldn't work with local police because they're local, they're easy to influence. So what he needed was a police force that was reformed and that wasn't local, right? So that people that police us in Nuevo León are not actually from Nuevo León. They are from Baja California. So you can't threaten their mother because their mother doesn't live here, right? Or it's harder to bribe them because they're not there. They sleep in the barracks, not in their home. So you needed that type of police, right? This was not, people in Moreno were kind of surprised when he did it because this was not the plan. It was just something that very soon developed that there was a need for this type of thing. Do that make sense?
Yeah.
And this comes from how the government acts, not from its conscious reasoning. Anyway, these are your four levels: activities, measures, policy lines, and principles. These are 4 moments when new policies get born. And that's it for this class, dear students. What questions do you have, or what do you want to talk about?
I think it was clear.
Sorry? It was clear, somebody said. And what did the other person say?
Yeah, that I was thinking if I have summed up.
Okay. Did you learn anything from this?
Yes, I think this is what I say. This was a very interesting class because we had never get to know like all the steps of policy making. I mean, I know these are not all of them, but at least in the planning, like at least we know how to start to create a policy. I think that's something very useful from this class.
That is something we're going to talk about more next time. Right? Today is a bit more about like when does it happen. Next time we're going to talk about not policy design, but well, the process of making policy, the different steps that you go through from having an idea to doing it, or that you should go to. But yeah, that leads to this. Okay, thank you. Any other comments, things you want to talk about? Yes.
I got confused and I want to know like what's the difference between measures and activities, like the 3rd and the 4th point.
Measures are the policies themselves, are projects of the government, and activities are how they're carried out.
Okay.
So you can have a measure, but the activity that comes with it is different. Like you're supposed to do one thing, but you do something else. Okay. To answer a bit more on a meta level, I agree with you that this is confusing. This is not my framework, right? I try to explain the best way I could. But the activities part has more to do with policies or things that the state does. They were never planned. That didn't come from above. That were not on the agenda. They just happen because the government officials, the lower rank people, are behaving a certain way. Or they just decide to do it. That's also possible, right? So nobody ever approved this, but a certain police force, it's easier to say with the police, just start doing some new type of policy, like racial profiling, for example. While measures are still things that were planned.
Okay. Yeah, like measures is how you want them to be,
Mm-hmm.
and activities are like the things that happen during the policy.
Yes, but I agree with you. This distinction is not very important, right? The main point is things can happen because politicians are inspired by certain principles. Things can happen because they intentionally try to do it, and then there's a lot of space to provide policies that meet that goal. And things can happen in the execution that policies lead to other policies. That's kind of this summary of it. Mr. Diego.
Yeah, I think about an example, but I want you to tell me like where is better located, in measures or in activities. For example, when there is this like thing about agricultural programs that they say people, okay, if you have like a space to plant something, I can give you 10,000 pesos a month. So then people starts like cutting trees in order to have a space and to get these 10,000 pesos. So I think it has happened at some point in Mexico. I don't know if now.
Probably.
So yeah, you start a problem because to get a benefit or policy, you have like people starting a deforestation problem.
That would be more under the consequence of measures, because it's a consequence of the design of the program.
Okay.
But anyway, this distinction isn't that important. You could as well forget. You could as well take the last two as the same thing. I'm not committed to this. It's not something I came up with. It's just to understand that policy is a lot more than the president thinking about something, right? There's a lot of other ways things can happen or that can lead to public policy that have nothing to do with party politics, or at least that don't start from party politics. Okay. Any other thing you want to discuss about class, life, politics? No?
I saw you post a new essay.
Oh yeah, I forgot to make advertisement for that. I did. I'm critiquing the judicial class in this one. I think it's interesting. So yes, please check that out, all of you. Miss Mariana.
I wanted to ask in your case, for example, when you try to implement a new policy, you have like a established process, or you just try to like talk with the people who can make the policy change, or how does it
In
work?
my case, There's been a few times in my life that I've done this on different levels too. In my previous job, I did. In what was my PhD? But my PhD was like contract research. Like the research I did was for some organization that paid me for the government. This was policy analysis of social innovation relating to food. So I developed some ideas on how to improve food distribution, like charity, not charity, like food banks, like helping hungry people. That type. There's many ways of doing that, and I took two paths. One is that I simply worked for the government. So they didn't work. I was not a civil servant. I was a contract by the government to give them advice. This was actually the least fruitful one because they just don't listen. So you go to meetings and you explain your research and they say, oh yeah, that's very interesting. And then they like draw like pictures of their dog on paper. So that was my experience with direct working with government. They listen to some things, but not the important things. And then I tried to speak at as many places I could. So social work, media, sometimes municipalities would invite me, or social services would. I spoke for the European Commission on this. I went to, I would just get absorbed into all kind of advisory committees and groups. And there, I didn't achieve what I necessarily wanted, but I helped to changing policy a little bit by just bringing people together that were more powerful than me and having them think about things and then giving advice. That led to some minor changes, but not necessarily me. Like me and a bunch of other people did that. I've participated a little bit in very local policy change. I think I told this story before, to protest, where we wanted the city that I lived in to designate more money to social housing, and there was a building that the city had. It was a former school for nurses, but that didn't exist like since 50 years, and they wanted to sell it privately. So the government owned this building, but they wanted to sell it. And we was my political party there, we boycotted the sale. Like every time people were gonna sell, like people would come to see, we'd be there with like 100 people like, you shouldn't buy this, it's terrible, it's haunted, like don't do it. And then they didn't sell, like nobody wanted to buy it. So the government kept it, and it's social housing now. So that was a more activist, that's from the outside, right? And then here in Nivleon, I'll tell you a bit more about that the other day, about the making of the plan. I didn't start this. I was hired to do it. It was a convocatoria by the Nivleon government, but they didn't want what I gave them. Like they just write something about robots. Like how, like come talk about the problems of robots for work. That was the assignment basically. And there were two projects. One was just that, right? And they had one idea to solve it, basic income, but their variant of it, where I analyzed the problem, I analyzed their plan. I eventually said I didn't like it too much. It was my general conclusion. And I said, but we should maybe do this other thing. And then they decided to give us money again to develop the next plan into public policy. And I'll talk about that later in another class, how we did that. But what I did afterwards is, the original plan was that they were gonna push this for me, but they failed enormously. They were late with everything. They were half convinced of it. They means it was a committee. This was universities, employers, and syndicates, led by universities. that they didn't really push it. There was some like, there was like an event where we, like a conference, where the government people would be there, but they put me last. So like I was like last speaker. They just invited people who had nothing to do, like from Chile. They invited people to talk. So by the time I got to speak, all the policy people were gone. It was just the audience. So that was a missed opportunity. And then I tried to do, so that since I saw that that was going to fail, the normal way of agenda setting, they were failing at agenda setting this. I tried to do it directly via politics. And I tried to, I talked to people, they put me in contact with other people, and then I came with the plan to try to do it via Morena first. We approached some Congress people, they liked it, but then they got back to me saying that they looked into it and they couldn't do it because this required executive power. That you couldn't do this as a lawmaker, you needed the governor to do it. So then we got kind of involved in the race for governor, right? And we worked to get to Tatiana Cloutier, thinking that she would be the candidate. We were wrong. And we gambled again on another person, tried to get to them, talk to them. We were wrong again. We never got to Clara because by that time we fell apart, the team. But it would have failed anyway because she lost. So the next plan is to just talk about this as much as I can in media. Try to get the topic going, and I need to kind of think what I'm gonna do next. If I want to just keep pushing this and try to use Morena to propose it, or if I should try to talk to Movimiento Ciudadano about it. I'm undecided. I kind of paused this project because my first push wasn't too successful. But I'm a foreigner. It's not surprising that it didn't work. But I keep talking about it whenever I can.
You could become Mariana Rodriguez's best friend.
Maybe if their kids go to school with our kids, that's like the only hope for that to happen. But yeah, no. But it is, my plan is possible because the PRI proposed this nationally at some point. They failed to do it because they were in coalition with the PAN and the PAN torpedoed it. But the PRI is not against the principle. They might not agree with, my version is very specific of this plan. They might not agree with my version, but they're not in principle against this. And Samuel said something like he once talked about basically a stupid version of this, like only during the pandemia or something like that. But I think Movimiento would not oppose this, let's say. So I think there's a majority for it in León. We just need someone to place it on the table. My best chance of that is via Morena. The guy I talked to, he lost elections, but I found another person now. But if not, I might need to get some other party to propose this. I don't know. I have to think about it. All right. While I reflect upon my failures to do this and come up with a new plan, I'll let you go. But I'm going to talk about the plan another time and show you how it went through the different steps of policy making. Okay?
Okay.
See you.
Teacher.
Hey, teacher.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, teacher.